here today with Chris Hessler and Michael Rensing. And we've got just a couple of questions for you two gentlemen here today. So maybe we'll start it off with you, Chris. Would you be able to provide a bit of a high-level overview of the current political landscape in the U.S. and how that relates to financial incentives for all of these fund programs under development?
Sure. That's a half-hour question, so I'll just try and do a few minutes on it. But as everybody knows, and people have been talking about, the IRA and the infrastructure law have been a huge injection of funding into the broad space of decarbonization. Just to talk numbers very quickly, the IRA alone, the infrastructure law put nearly $70 billion into DOE's hands to distribute through grant programs for demonstration and R&D work of decarbonization projects. On top of that came the IRA, or IRA, depending on who you're talking to. That is going to put over the next 8 years or so, somewhere in the neighborhood of $1 trillion of incentive that will, according to projections, multiply it to about a $13 trillion market investment outcome. So far, we're just past the 1-year anniversary of that law coming into effect. We have seen about $30 billion of direct investment actually occurring as part of an announced $300 billion worth of investment in the space. So big dollars, huge multinational companies all of a sudden flocking to the space. The good is that has happened, and it's a fairly stable new policy that's influencing investments globally. The bad is that there's a lot of detail on some of the specific tax credits that have not yet come out. And the ugly, which I think we're going to spend a little more time talking about, relates to the politics here. There's some uncertainty about some of these programs. I don't think it overall undermines the confidence in the scale and scope and diversity of those incentives, but there's definitely a little bit of risk that people have to manage for.
And Michael, how do you find that Canada stacks up comparatively at this point in time?
Well, I don't have the same knowledge about all the programs available, but the issue is scaling up, is getting things built. And nobody is going to make that capital investment if there isn't a market. And I've been listening to conversations, and we're talking about various parts of a bioeconomy. And if you have a market or you're creating a new market, that's one thing. But in the fuel world, you're trying to break into an existing market. Nobody is going to be able to outcompete fossil fuel on a price basis without some form of carbon pricing. You can get support to build a facility. And in fact, we're seeing an investment commitment from Imperial Oil. They do have support from the BC provincial government that is worth money, but it's not a grant. It's not interest-free loan or a tax credit. They're also obviously going to take care of everything else. But Imperial Oil can make a decision on a $750 million investment without having to convince a bank that they are a real company. And so the small, medium enterprises that are creative, that have the new technologies, are trying to go out and get support to build something. And that support is out there. We're hearing about the various programs. It's a diverse landscape. It's not easy to understand, but it is there. And then you have a market for your product. Well, in the fuel world, feedstock dominates. Canola and soy are $2 a liter. Diesel is $1.20. And you have to convert the oil into fuel, add 50 cents. The policies are what close that price gap. If you're building a refinery and investing $200 to $750 million, you can get all the support you need, interest-free loans, tax credits, to build the facility, but you can't pay off your debt if you can't sell the product. The IRA has the producer's tax credit that makes it necessary under today's rules for a fuel producer to compete on price with somebody who could be located 50 kilometers away, making the exact same product from the same feedstock and selling it into Canada 10 cents a liter cheaper. So we do have to address that issue. We have to come up with something that addresses the policy pricing gap, or the pricing gap that is related to policy, if we want to see those renewable fuels come in. And I heard Bob, I don't see Bob in the room anymore, Bob LaRock yesterday saying we make all our fuels domestically. Bob is with the Petroleum Association, and he's right. We are a net exporter of petroleum products. We are a huge importer of the biofuels that are being generating the compliance, and particularly in the diesel pool, we make almost none in Canada. So for the last 10 years, fuel policies in British Columbia have been, thank you US, heavily subsidized $1 a gallon US by getting advantage of the blender's tax credit. And that's one of the changes in the IRA. So all the fuel prices for stuff coming up this way are going to go up $1 a gallon as soon as the blender's tax credit is inaccessible, because there's no producer's tax credit available coming across. At the same time, no, I have to take that back, Chris. You're raising your eyebrows. Thank you. The producer's tax credit is available. What is not available is if you're a Canadian producer. So now you're able to send your product down into the States and get $1 a gallon. Currently now, with no blender's tax credit and a producer only, you can't even do that. So now there is no market that doesn't require a Canadian producer to compete on price. And I think that's the long-term problem on the energy side. We have to have some kind of solution for the product pricing for biofuels.
Did you want to chime in with any rebuttal points in here, Chris? No, good. Well then, whereabouts in the political landscape do you think things are potentially going to change or support further measures like this?
So, prognostication questions are always great, predict the future. My crystal ball's broken, so I'm not going to do that, but I will say this.
Speak straight into it.
Oh, I'm sorry. So I'm not going to make a prediction about where politics are going to go in the U.S., but I will say that conventional wisdom, and I subscribe to it around the tax credits, is that they are primarily going to stay in place. There will probably be some clawback of some type if there is a Republican takeover of government. However, yesterday in many parts of the U.S., including the state of Virginia where I live, yesterday was an election day, and there were some pretty notable results. Who knows what that tells us about a year from now and what will happen in that election. But we'll be back here right after that to discuss that. So one of them, and I just threw around a bunch of big numbers, and Michael's talking about the tax credit, and I know that if you're sitting here in Canada, it's easy to say, well, gosh, the Canadian Treasury just can't keep up. We just don't have those kinds of resources. Okay, fair enough. But that's not the only tool in the toolkit. And when I was getting ready to come up here, I asked one of the folks on my team, I was like, a lot's been happening lately. I really want to make sure I'm on top of all the details of what we've been doing in the U.S. on bioeconomy strategies. And this is what I was given. This 1-inch thick book is what I was given to summarize what's happening in the U.S. It's breathtaking. Jeff titled this session "Bold Goals," taking from the White House strategy on bioeconomy, which was entitled "Bold Goals." And the thing that is 100% replicable here in Canada is probably the most powerful and most politically durable element of what the Biden administration has done, especially with regard to bioeconomy. And that is to take this whole of government strategy. So what's woven into the bold goals from the White House is this concept that unless you're looking across all the agencies and all the programs in those agencies at how they can contribute in an integrated way to the outcome, all of these complex problems that we've been spending the last day and a half talking about don't really make forward progress. So what the Bold Goals document does is it weaves together what's happening at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, the National Science Foundation's investments on R&D, which are tens of millions of dollars, Department of Defense, hundreds of millions of dollars on trying to find bioproduct replacements for their acquisition. Department of Energy on project and R&D, on and on and on. But tying them together to solve these problems, because they're all multidimensional problems, and we recognize that. The government in Canada could do that quite easily and effectively, and that would be politically durable. It's probably, again, no one expects $1 trillion of Canadian to be laid out in the next 8 years to compete with us, or even if you scale that down for the relative size of the economy. No one expects that. But there are really important things that Canada could do to take advantage of one of its most abundant natural resources.
And I think you have to, as a Canadian, you have to think about federal-provincial relationships and where the traditional authorities go. Forests are provincial, energy is provincial, but not really, right? We need that coordination. I think there needs to be some work done on solving that. But I would say for Canada, the biggest issue right now is that big part of the federal plan has been the carbon tax and the clean fuel regulations, other measures as well, all in a package of creating a carbon pricing system. And in the last couple of months, we have really seen the opposition to what has been characterized as taxes. So carbon tax is a visible tax. Clean fuel regulation is not a tax, but it has an effect on the price of fuels, and it has been mischaracterized as a tax by the opposition. And the leader of the opposition, who is recently elected, has publicly stated and committed that he will be axing the tax. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done to try and make sure that he doesn't reverse economically beneficial, environmentally beneficial policy completely, because that's what you do when you axe a tax. You just repeal the act and it all goes away. I don't think there's anybody who is in business in this area that wants to see that happen. But it is front and center as the next policy. How do you invest in that climate? Right? Within 2 years, there has to be a federal election. How do you invest multiple hundred millions of dollars into an infrastructure that needs to be able to do its business for 25 to 40 years when in 2 years, the only thing that allows you to be competitive goes away? And I don't have answers. Yes, but if there is no carbon pricing, there's no need for contract for differences. We down tools and go home and continue to emit. That's the thing with taking away the whole package. If you can find a way to rebrand, make the policies more acceptable, explain that we have a crisis, and these are the best answers society has found so far, you might get somewhere. But we've got 18 months, and I wasn't in Ottawa to experience the truckers' convoy, but it apparently was hell to be around here at that time for months, because protesters on fuel prices had the streets. So this is our political climate right now. And with apologies to any American, but the 2016 election did not set a good example for sensible politics. And I think what everybody's worried about is that there's something happening here that might not be sensible at the end of it all.
So maybe a little bit astray now from the political stage, in terms of build-out incentives versus, production incentives. What do you think are some of the best approaches that, either government or could take to help stimulate projects, across both borders?
Michael's made the essential point. There's a premium, and the premium has to be covered. And people will debate, should it be a production tax credit? Should it be an investment tax credit? Should it be a contract for difference? There's lots of different ways to think about it. The reality is that unless it's a profitable enterprise, it's not going to happen. People aren't going to invest in it long term unless there's a stable market around it. One of the things people are coming to recognize in the U.S. now is that with all of these lucrative investment opportunities, there are still problems. So hydrogen is one of the things that we're spending a lot of time talking about. Hydrogen from biomass, hydrogen from water, hydrogen from a lot of, just hydrogen from fossil methane or renewable methane. But the issue they're coming to recognize now, just a year in past the adoption of the IRA, is there aren't market demands. So if you can make clean hydrogen competitive on a price basis with fossil hydrogen, that's lovely. But who cares if you don't have a long-term market demand? If you don't have someone saying, yes, I prefer to buy that on an equal price footing. And right now, there aren't real clear drivers on that side. So that is the next hill to climb. But on the core question, there are differences that are important from a project perspective on a production tax credit or an investment tax credit, but they're just different ways of covering the cost. You can do it on a mandate basis. There are a lot of different ways of covering the cost, but that cost has to be covered or people aren't going to build.
I think that's why you're starting to see, 15 years with the low carbon fuel standard. California and BC went together on this, and I've been in that from the beginning, so for me it has been 15 years. What policies like that do is it doesn't just put a price on carbon. Putting a price on carbon means making the cost of the GHG emissions explicit, and in a way that the capitalist system understands. So you want to continue selling a liter of fossil fuel, you may do that, but you are going to have an extra cost imposed, and you're in charge of how much that is, but it has to involve GHG reductions. And the industry is finding right now BC compliance credits are selling around $500 Canadian per ton. And it is not too difficult to do the waterfall chart and the stack of policy incentives to show that that is, under the right circumstances, very comparable to California's situation today of $78 US a ton for a credit under the same act. Why is that? All of the other policies that are buying down. Renewable fuel companies, I heard an interesting characterization, don't sell fuel. They sell compliance. And what we did in BC, actually, sorry, I feel like I'm advertising myself, but I'm a recovering regulator. There's a program in there called Part 3 agreements. Those of you who know. What it is that fuel suppliers must do something to reduce carbon intensity. There are two factors to think about. There's the capital cost and the initiation of it, and then there's the ongoing economic viability. The credit price kind of reflects the ongoing economic viability, but how do you get that initial investment? So we created a program that invites proponents to come to the government and say, we want to do this, here are the GHG benefits, and they're awarded an agreement that gives them compliance units. Now, one company took those compliance units and monetized them by doing a future contract that gave them an assured income source that they put up against their equity in the bank and got the financing for building their biorefinery. Another company is just holding on to their credits because while they're getting them coming in and they're building their facility, they're not distracting themselves buying trainloads of fuel out of Louisiana. So there are different ways of going about it that are getting infrastructure built with the assurance that in the long run there will be demand for the new fuels and recognize the higher cost, because the market, if feedstock costs come down to $1 instead of $2, the price of compliance comes down. That's what's happening in California, not feedstock and biofuel, but electricity and other sources of credits. It's 10 times the size of California, and Canada are about the same size market. The California market in this space is a lot more competitive than British Columbia. So we're now seeing the benefits in California of action and competition.
So, as you know, Michael, I'm a huge fan of the LCFS. I think it is probably the model program that everyone should be looking at. It is the technology neutrality has allowed the private sector to find innovative, often surprising ways to reduce carbon intensity, what they're bringing to market, and that has led to a diversity of solutions that people didn't necessarily expect. In California, we had a very high sustained price for the premium in the LCFS without political disruption. And because the market has responded incredibly well, we now have a much lower price because the market's wildly oversupplied. It means we're going faster on decarbonizing than anyone expected. And this is not a program that's being debated on a regular basis in the California State House. They're fine with it. It's working. We need to figure out how to copy that model. It both pays for and creates demand driver all in one program.
There's a lot of similarity to output-based pricing systems, where every industry does what it can, generates a reduction, puts the documentation of that production into a credit market system that validates that and then says there's a fungibility here that allows you to sell it. The value is, under the federal backstop system, should be the same as carbon tax, $65 now, going up to $170. Contract for difference guarantees the minimum price, but that is a mechanism where bioeconomy players are able to do what they do best, focus on their business, and generate that extra revenue needed to cover the difference. And the economists will argue that if you can't get a good enough price in that market, we actually don't want your action. So the other piece is we got to keep tightening up the standards to make sure there's always demand for more and more credits, because that's what brings the emissions down. And it's interesting, in the federal picture, we're playing in a field where we're trying to get started on this. In the fuel regulation, the net increase will be about 12%. British Columbia is currently at 20% and heading for 30 by 2030. As long as we can get the biofuel, those targets will be met. And the net impact then is, the numbers, if I recall, in 2018, 2019, carbon tax was about 10 cents a liter. And the cost impact of all the introduction of biofuels for the previous 10 years at the pump in the time frame was about 3 cents a liter. The analysis was that the low carbon fuel standard was more effective, reduced more tons of emissions than the carbon tax. So carbon tax is not the only way to go.
That's
right.
Yeah. I think Logan was
We just have a question from the audience about how we can garner better support from opposition parties, to continue or not axe the tax, since industry seems to be generally in favor of this particular policy set at the moment.
That's for you.
That's for me. So I'm thinking a little in my experience, and I think probably many people would answer what I think is the wrong answer. We should educate them. They know what they want to say. They know what they want to achieve. And education is going to just cause their eyes to cross. My assistant deputy minister would always shake his head when we came out of a cabinet briefing. He said, no briefing is complete until you've given us all a migraine. It's too complicated. What I think we're probably going to need to not axe the tax or not axe the clean fuel program is for everybody to forget their differences and go into their local Conservative Party MLA office and say, we need these policies to be stable. If you want to fix it, we'll help you fix it, but you can't throw the baby out with the bathwater.
So we have about a minute left. Any final thoughts that you'd like to weigh in before we pass the mic back to Jeff?
Just that this really is, this conference continues to be a gathering of a tremendous amount of intellectual heft about how to solve complex problems. And it's certainly one of the reasons why AJW continues to sponsor it. I look forward to next year when the conversation about government incentives in Canada is much more mature than it is right now. And I'm hoping that the politics that Canada is going through forces folks to wrestle with the question you just asked, Logan. How do we ensure that we are focused on decarbonization policies that will have durable support? And that means among the voters in Canada, not just one party or the other.
Just an observation. Sponsorship of this conference includes the Canadian Fuels Association. There are two representatives of that association, at least here. The petroleum industry is now passionately involved with the bioeconomy. 10 years ago, they said, you can't make me.
Just to riff on that, when the California LCFS was being hotly debated in its early years, the word that was the most favorite word used by petroleum companies was infeasible. The 10% reduction was an infeasible target. We heard that at every hearing from every petroleum witness, that word. And we have blown so far past that we are now in a conversation in California about if 35% is too mild because we can go much further.
Thank you very much for your insights, gentlemen, and we'll pass it back to Jeff.
Well,